Yeah, it's Thursday. Okay, well then better. But still, we're in a dark room. It's an hour after lunch, and we're getting technical talk. So I wish I brought something exciting, a t-shirt cannon or something, a raffle in the middle to keep people energized. But I promise I won't go over 20 minutes. And before I do, I want to point out, self-serving, these two centers, because Steve Polasky asked, what's the proper role for RCTs, or roles, plural? And one of them that we talked about with Seema's presentation is measuring the actual impacts of environmental interventions. But I think another, maybe even more promising use is that I see a lot of competing ideas here about how humans behave, what is underlying driving humans. And I think that RCTs can help elucidate. Even over lunch, we had an argument about firms and business behavior and farmers and what's driving the observed patterns in their behavior, which we need to understand in order to design interventions aimed at changing their behavior. And experiments often can be a good opportunity to adjudicate between rival behavioral theories. I mean, John's done a lot of work, and there's a lot of the behavioral economists are often doing that. And CBER and EPIC are these two centers. One's funded by U.S. Department of Agriculture, works in the agricultural space, and one was working with EPA no longer, but now working with state agencies that embeds RCTs into actual environmental programs, not to measure their impacts, but to test underlying theories about what makes firms comply or not comply, what makes farmers change their behaviors in ways that might benefit the environment or hurt it. And if anybody's interested in those or has things along those lines that want to have some extra interactions with a broader network of people, let me know. But today, this is work with Jim Sanchirico, Marty Smith, who many of you know, work in the fisheries domain, talking about causal inference in social ecological systems. I think it's a spatial dynamic systems. We're trying to broaden it to this idea of temporally and spatially dynamic coupled natural human systems, which is most of what people in this room are working on. And with the nature of the session, we're asking, I don't see the clock going, that's great, I'm getting extra time. Given the nature of socio-ecological systems, under what conditions can we measure the causal effects of a policy or event, like a hypoxic event or a monsoon, with reduced form approaches? And no, I'm not positive that everybody understands what reduced form means, but people have been using identification econometrics, so the economists know, but if you're not an economist, I don't want to go through too much detail, but just sort of hammer home that the ultimate reduced form approach is the randomized controlled trial. So both Saul and Dan referred to this idea of mimicking randomization. All right, so where we're trying to identify the effects of causes, where we take this large elaborate system and we focus narrowly on one causal pathway. We've got the treatment, which is the causal variable, and it affects some outcome, so social or ecological outcome. And what we're really worried about in reduced form approaches is these confounding variables, these things that affect exposure to the causal variable. Why is some areas protected, some areas not? Why are some areas getting hit by monsoons or getting higher temperatures or whatever it might be, higher exposure to pollutants? That may also be correlated with the social and ecological outcomes that we're measuring. And it's distinguished from these other approaches, structural, which often can be called causes of effect, where there's lots of causes in there that might be identified with data, or might be constrained by theoretical assumptions, or just embedding parameters into that, or ecologists often use multimodal inference, which is largely competing theories and looking at goodness of fit. Reduced form distinguishes itself by the strength of the causal claims. It's much stronger. Dan was talking about this trade-off that we might experience in terms of getting high internal validity. This is credibly causal, but it's not as interesting, or it's not answering the question that we want to answer. And also, ecologists, I think, are often shocked at the indifference to model fit. When economists, we don't talk about R-squareds or AIC or BIC. People run randomized experiments, might have R-squares of 0.02, 0.04, and no one cares, which I think for ecologists who are much more prone to looking at prediction, goodness of fit, that's sort of a shocking, because it's fundamentally a different idea. I mean, when people who do randomized controlled trials in ecology also don't worry about goodness of fit, and that's what our benchmark here is in this approach. So, what we're interested in is interrogating the plausibility of two fundamental assumptions in all reduced form designs. These two are embedded in randomized controlled trials through the observational designs that Saul and Dan were talking about. First one's called the excludability assumption, or exclusion restriction. Now, economists know the language exclusion restriction, often think of it in the context of instrumental variables, but it's embedded in all reduced form designs. Randomized controlled trial, and when David Tillman varies the species composition in these plots out in the field, he's making the assumption that that mechanism by which he's randomly varying the species has no effect on the outcomes he's measuring, like productivity, except through the causal variable he's interested in, the species composition. When Seema randomized the PES program through pulling a ball out in a public meeting, she's implicitly assuming that that pulling out of the ball has no effect on deforestation or social welfare outcomes except through its influence on who gets the PES program and who doesn't. If some communities are really disappointed they didn't get it and get angry and change their behavior or excited, whatever it might be, then that's a violation of the excludability. So broadly speaking, this is an important assumption that may be hard to believe in the particular kinds of designs that we see in the socio-ecological system literature. And the other one, the one that we do more time on with simulations, theory, trying to identify sufficient statistics to understand more, is the plausibility of, it goes by different names, no interference assumptions, stable unit value treatment assumptions, SUTVA. And this assumes basically that, let's say we're talking about particulates, pollution, and we're looking at the causal effect on me when I'm exposed to high versus low particulates. I'm implicitly assuming that those outcomes, my health outcome when I'm exposed to high particulates versus low, is unaffected by whether anybody else is exposed to particulates. Right? That treatment effects are not conditional on the marginal treatment or exposure rate. Right? So when Seema, for example, talked about leakage, and she was worried that you treated these areas and you displaced pressure into the control areas, that's a SUTVA violation or a violation of interference, where it makes a difference. What that control unit's deforestation would look like depends upon whether they're near or far from a treated unit. Right? That's embedded. These are embedded in all the studies that we do, and it's unclear whether they'll both be plausible. So there's three overarching messages or key messages in the paper we're writing. One is pretty obvious, that we've got complex, dynamic, interconnected systems, so it creates challenges for identifying causal effects. People pointed that out. But what we also want to point out is the incongruity between the kind of designs that populate the sustainable science literature, trying to identify these causal relationships, and the challenge. It's a big gulf. Right? We have this very challenging, like Seema says, she doesn't think that the environmental is very much different. It's not, but it has a lot of the problems that lots of fields have in spades, I think, in terms of the scale, the possible violations of assumptions, and the designs we're using don't really address that. Second message is, so there is in economics this structural versus reduced form debate. And what we mean by structural models is we're actually talking about the functional form, the underlying behavioral theory, thinking about the different parameter values, but structural knowledge is still key for reduced form design. You have to understand how the system operates. It may not be in that same quantitative way that you see in the structural literature, but you still need to understand how the system works to identify units of analysis, to guide the data collection, and make transparent and credible the assumptions for inferring causality. And it's often not being applied in the sustainability science literature and socio-ecological system literature. So this is basically the reduced form problem. We've got D, a causal variable, a hypoxic event, protected area. We've got Y, a social ecological outcome, species diversity, deforestation, poverty. And we're wondering, what are these X's and U's? The X's I can observe, the U's I can. These things that affect exposure to my causal variable, that are affecting variation of that causal variable across space or time, that also affect my outcome. These are the confounding variables that mimic or mask causal effects. We're trying to isolate I, variation that affects exposure to D, like randomization is the ideal one, one ideal one, that doesn't connect to Y except through its path through D. And the only way you can do a design is with structural knowledge. You have to understand what are the plausible X's, what are the U's, what are just G's, things that affect deforestation but are unrelated to who gets exposed to a PES project, or affect health and unrelated to who gets exposed to varying levels of particulate matter. But when you look at the literature, right, this idea that this is what we want to be left with in our study, right, something that mimics, here's an experimenter randomizing the value of D, which then affects Y, or here's nature after we condition or difference out fixed effects or other designs that's affecting the variation in D. we looked at over 140 marine protected area empirical papers. Right? So they're trying to measure the effects of marine protected areas. Fewer than 5 out of 140 identified the sources of variation in marine protected areas. Why are some areas protected and other areas are not? And if you don't clarify what's fancily called the treatment assignment mechanism, why are some units exposed to more pollution, others not, higher temperatures, others not, you can't do a good empirical design. It's missing from this literature. And the third message is that treated units, like what is exposed to the causal variable, are best viewed as coupled pairings of environmental and human elements of the socio-ecological system. Right? So when we put in a protected area, it's not just the land or the coral reef that is exposed to the treatment, it's a pairing of the coral reef segment and the fishermen or fishers that would be exploiting that reef in the absence or in the presence of the protected area. Right? Treatments, these causes aren't assigned, and when I say assigned, it could be by a human or it could be by nature or policymaker, to environmental units separate from the human units. And that's not, again, it's not, wow, that's a mind-blowing insight, but that insight is typically ignored in this socio-ecological system. So I'm going to stick with the marine protected area context, just to keep the example similar. In this literature, typically most of the articles only have data after protection. It's really hard to infer causality from cross-sectional variation in some causal variable like protection. But a few, and what often the ecologists call the sort of the gold standard, have before measures of, say, fishing stock or harvest, and then after, usually only one before, one after. And they try to find a similar control area, and they do what economists would call difference in differences. They call Bakke designs, and try to say, well, how do the trends differ in the group that's protected versus unprotected? And typically when they try to find similar units, it's on biophysical elements. We found fewer than 6 or 7 that actually try to find similarity on the human or the economic side. And I don't have time to go through this numerical example. It's in the next slide. But as you might imagine, it matters. Right? If you don't get similarity on the human side, you're just getting in the biophysical side, you can have gross mistakes in your causal inferences. Also, understanding that you've got to have the human element in here is important. That's 5, that says 7. Okay, I'll go with the 5. Okay, 7, all right. Is when to actually measure, right, outcomes. Right, so this is a simulation that Marty ginned up, and the idea is this is a fishery. I think it's modeled on a shrimp fishery in the Gulf. And the idea is that the fishery is going along, and time is on the horizontal axis, and we have 3 different outcomes: harvest, effort, and stock. And then at day 100, something happens, a treatment, an intervention that raises the cost of harvesting by 50%. So say it's a gear restriction. All right, so we're in an open access fishery prior to that, where rents have been dissipated to 0, where they basically at the Nash equilibrium. Then day 100, this shock comes along, and what you're seeing here is in the blue is what would happen had that shock never happened, right? The counterfactual. This is what would happen if we never had the gear restriction, never raised the cost of harvesting. And the red is what we observe after the intervention. So it's a simulation. You never observe both for the same fishery, because it's simulated, we have both here. So the difference between the red and the blue line is the treatment effect. So looking at effort, we can see that effort goes down. Looking at stock, we can see that stock goes up as a result of this. But often we only have catch data or harvest data. All right? And if we come in, right, and this is the treatment effect on stock, which is what we often, this is what we care about. If you come in and you look at the short run, 50, 60 days afterward in this model, you would see that the harvest, the catch, went down, suggesting that the stock has been negatively affected. But that's a human response to the treatment effect. If you wait a little bit longer, you're going to get these different dynamics that are going on over time. Depending on when you measure it, you might imagine there's a very large effect or quite a small effect. And if you wait even longer, we'll get sort of settle down to a long-run equilibrium, and we'll see a treatment effect that more mimics what's actually happening to the stock all along. And so ignoring that we have this coupled pairing, and that we have to think about the treatment response on both of these systems, you can get the wrong inference by measuring at a particular point in time, not having that structural information. Right? So the structural knowledge is still important in a reduced form design. All right, so the last 5 minutes, I want to focus on what we think is the bigger contribution of this paper, is focusing on this interference, or SUTVA, this spillovers, leakage, contamination. And this idea that's in every study, experimental or not, that assumes that outcomes don't depend upon whether other units have been treated or not. As you can imagine, in complex, dynamic, interconnected systems, this might be a really hard assumption to believe. And when you look at a lot of reduced form econometrics, there's not really any interrogation of it. So people who do forest stuff often try to look at it in a very limited way, including myself, and Seema's done this, and Alex, and Sabrina's try to look at leakage or spillovers or displacement. But we often do it in a somewhat of an ad hoc way. We don't have a lot of structural knowledge that we put onto it and put a lot of time into measuring it. But there's a reason to believe there's a lot of common mechanisms for these spillovers or interference. It's a picture of a marine protected area in a paper that came out in 2017 making this point that it's probably important how displacement of fishing pressure to other areas that we might be using as controls can make a big difference in the inference we're making, has a big impact on what is exactly that we're measuring in terms of the impact. And that can happen through treatment, moving the humans into untreated areas like you see in that picture, right? It can happen in Seema's with deforestation. They went and collected their forest wood or their timber wood in neighboring communities rather than the areas where they had protected via the payments. Or the treatment can change the behaviors of the untreated humans or attributes of the untreated ecosystem in the untreated area. So what do I mean by that? Right. We talked, I think, probably mentioned price mediation. So if we come into one area and we shut down the salmon fishery in Chile, that's probably going to have an effect on prices. They're going to change behavior in Norway and other places that are big salmon fisheries. And if you're using them as the untreated, the comparison units, they're going to be in some ways contaminated, right? They're not representing the counterfactual for Chile, regardless of how you've weighted things or what kind of data you're using. You can have ecology-mediated spillovers where you get dispersal or changes in predator-prey that happen at a distance as a result of protecting the area. Again, making it so that it's possible that your control units are contaminated. They don't represent the counterfactual for the treated. And you can have information transfers that people see. So in Seema's example, people could see that these other communities were protecting their forests. They were getting engaged with this NGO, and they may have decided to change their behavior. Let's protect forests, a good idea. Or maybe we'll get engaged with the NGO as well if we show that we're good citizens. Right? These are all violations of the implicit assumption underlying the reduced form designs that people use to try to uncover causal relationships. They often can be considered a nuisance, right? That I want to eliminate that. I want to find untreated units that represent what would happen in a treated area had it not been treated. Or they may be exactly what we want to know about, so leakage in all these forest conservation programs. We actually want to know how much of the impact is being displaced to other areas. We want the net effect for these global environmental goods. We don't care about, well, we reduced carbon in this location, but we increased it over here. We want to know both of those of activities, and those require structural knowledge of the situation and formal designs aimed at trying to uncover those. So what we try to do through theory, numerical simulations, and some appeals to the literature is try to identify, so I can't go through this numerical example, but try to identify the conditions under which interference is going to be a serious problem. Talk about the ecological, the economic, and the institutional moderators of SES. For example, you can imagine fisheries that property rights are going to be a really important moderator for whether or not we have these sorts of spillovers or interference across areas. And try to talk about the different approaches for detecting that interference, measuring its magnitude, or eliminating its influence, if that's what you're trying to do in the analysis. Again, doing this all numerically in the paper, and illustrating with two particular contexts, hypoxic events and protected areas, both terrestrial and marine. And using those as vehicles to help people start thinking about, are there sufficient statistics that one could identify in your own context to say whether or not interference is likely to be a problem, and if it is likely to be a problem, how do I go about eliminating it, if that's what I want to do, or actually estimating its magnitude, if that's what's important. And with that, I'm done.